everyone. Um, it would since there's so few of us, and this is kind of intended to be an informal discussion. If you're able to turn on your camera, if you're comfortable doing that, we'd love to see you. If not, that's fine too. But my intention for this was to be a place where we can have an informal discussion about ideas in ecological economics that are out there in the world, being consumed in the popular audience through books. And so the first book I picked for this might seem a little bit of an odd choice because it's a fiction book, but it's a very unusual genre of fiction. I think the little blurb on the front of my version of the cover says the best science fiction nonfiction novel I've ever read, because this writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, is a science fiction writer. He's known for writing a lot of books about Mars, for example. But this book is a very unusual science fiction book in that it's set in the near-term future, and it's pretty much all, with very few exceptions, it's pretty much all technology and things that are current and available now, right? So it's not like some science fiction we read where it's set in a far-off future with a lot of imaginative technology and aliens and things like that. It's basically the story of how humankind solves the climate crisis, right? So the book, hopefully you've all had a chance to read at least part of it, starts in a kind of climate catastrophe heat wave in India that kills millions of people, and from there kind of goes into the story of how we get to the other side of the climate crisis. So the reason I wanted to choose this book, there's a couple of reasons related to ecological economics, and I'd love to open it up for your opinions on this too. But the one reason I wanted to choose this book for our inaugural kind of book club reading is because I feel like it's very solution oriented, right? Because it is the story of how the climate crisis is solved. There are literally, I think, probably hundreds of solutions in this book that are talked about. And I feel like that is very much our strength as a society, that we have moved in the last couple decades to really discussing solutions and ways to think about the economy, society, ecology, in the context of how do we actually get to a better future for ourselves and for the planet. And this book is really kind of writing about what that looks like and how do we get to the other side of this. And not just one solution, but hundreds of them, right? Hundreds of different things that can be done. So in that way, I feel like it's very hopeful, in spite of there's a lot of dark kind of things that happen in this book. It is very hopeful. The second thing is that I don't know if the author, Kim Stanley Robinson, is familiar with ecological economics. He never calls it out by name, but there are definitely ecological economics themes in this book, like very, very strongly. And so this morning I pulled up, I think a perfect example of this is chapter 73, which in my version is on page 365 and 366, where he's talking about something called modern monetary theory. So this is kind of his name for what I would say is ecological economics. And so I'll read on page 366, this is what he says about it. The MMT advocates replied they hoped to retain what was empirically useful in conventional economics as a social science for purposes of policy analysis, while reorienting economics' ultimate goals to human and biosphere welfare, thereby changing its policy perspectives and monetary theories, leading to recommendations for actions that would help get civilization through the narrowing gate of their crisis. Economics was a tool for optimizing actions to reach goals. The goals could be adjusted and should be, right? And so this really reminds me of, kind of the slogan that ecological economists have been using for decades about what is the economy for, right? That we decide what the goals are of the economy, and they should not be accumulating more wealth for a few. It should be about, exactly as he says here, human and biosphere welfare, right? So this is a key part of what the author, Stanley Robinson, is saying needs to be the transition to this new kind of future, this new near-term future. So anyway, those are the reasons I chose the book, even though it is a fiction book. I think that it's very rooted in reality. And so I would love to, like I said, I don't want to be talking this whole, I would love for this to be a discussion and to hear your ideas and, for us to just kind of share uh, our perspectives on some of the ideas contained in this book. So I guess what I want to do is I can start us off with a question, and then it can just be a free flowing discussion. And, there's, I guess 9 of us here. So just be conscious of, like, sharing, but also stepping back for others to share, and kind of free flowing discussion format. I'll step in if things get slow or if I need to redirect. But so my first question for the group, and maybe some of you read it, maybe some of you read it all the way or partly, but I watched this morning, so he wrote this book in 2019, right? It came out in 2020. And he since gave a talk at the Bioneers Conference, which is organized around biodiversity, and earlier this year. And he said at that talk that he's actually much more hopeful in 2023 than in 2019, that we will accelerate to the solution stage much faster than because in the book, some really dark things and some really dark times kind of happen before that occurs. Like, he kind of says in the book that the 2030s are like a lost decade, a zombie decade. He said in his talk earlier this year that he's now hopeful that we won't do that we will accelerate to solutions faster. And he named a number of reasons why. But I'm just curious, that's the author's perspective. But I'm curious for all of you, when you read this book, what were your reactions in terms of both the timeline and the solution set? I mean, did you think it was overly optimistic, overly pessimistic? Do you think it was about right on? What do you think that, what was your reaction to it kind of from that perspective in terms of, do you think the author got it right? Too fast, too slow? Is it possible? More or less possible than he said? I'm curious what your reactions are. And go ahead, Brett. We don't have to raise hands. Just be sensitive to each other, kind of ping pong off. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start. I thought it was semi-dystopian, but very appropriate. A lot of bad things were happening, particularly in India, and the extreme heat was a commonality, floods and whatnot. So from that perspective, yeah, that's pretty bad stuff. But we're starting to experience some of that in the real world. So I didn't think it was that far off topic, and I thought it was very appropriate as a bit of a wake-up call, because a lot of it rang very true to me reading through this. And I started working on climate change back in 1989, and I have to remind myself how many years that is, and I think that's 34 years now. Watching things happen over multiple decades on the issue, or not happen. But as far as how optimistic or pessimistic to be, I think we'll find out shortly, maybe as early as tomorrow, because in Dubai, they're working on the statement on whether or not it will explicitly mention phasing out fossil fuels, which is a big sticking point. OPEC, particularly Saudi Arabia, is resisting that, but more than 100 countries are fighting for its inclusion. So I think we'll see very shortly how accurate his recent prognostication was. I think the jury is still out, frankly.
I have a few thoughts that I really enjoyed the book. I think the dystopian aspects of it were actually a little too dramatic for me. That's not an assessment on reality. I mean, I found myself gravitating towards the institutions and processes and like you said, Laura, the solutions. I wanted to draw a parallel to a book that I had to read in school. It was Politics of the Anthropocene by Dryzek and Pickering. And I thought that this book was just a really emphatic statement at the inability right now of our institutions, their processes, their priorities, and so forth and so on, that were created in the Holocene to deal with Anthropocene problems. That theme kept coming up to me the whole time as I read the book. So I thought that was fascinating, and I did gravitate towards more the solutions in the book than the actual interpersonal drama.
Yeah, I thought it was, to your point, Bart, I thought in his talk to the Bioneers, it's clear that he very much understands the concept of institutional inertia that you're kind of referring to. You know, like he says, yeah, the past structures are not capable of handling where we need to go. And he made the point too that like, you know, I think his view in the book is very much that the crisis is what precipitates the rapid action, you know, and I think his point about why he's more hopeful now than 4 years ago is that we've had more crises just hitting that people are very conscious of. And so his opinion is that we're accelerating the action, you know, with the pandemic, multiple climate crises, you know, yeah, AI, the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, like everything just kind of coming at us. That was his perspective.
Rapid, abrupt system change. Yeah.
Exactly.
I thought the personal stuff and the dramatic stuff was very powerful literary because I think it just pulls in more people, and more people need to know about this and be involved in it. So I thought it was very effective that way.
Yeah, I would add that, you know, recent history indicates it's very unusual for significant policy change without crisis, that tends to be a stimulus. And the reason for that is institutions by definition resist change. They're mostly interested in perpetuating themselves and surviving.
Hello. I think for bike crisis, we need imaginations and solution for all levels. But the book is very interesting.
Yes, I'd agree with a lot of what's been said already. The one aspect, and this is my personal bias, is I just have a natural, based on my experiences, like want to push away from like the Marxist type stuff, philosophy, and that's, I will fully admit, that's my personal bias and inclination, and I found a lot of that in the book, and it bothered me, that aspect. I fully recognize capitalism has problems, but it's compared to what happened under those other models. You know, my personal feelings is it's better than that. But as far as the environment goes, I think Barry hit on it very nicely. The only thing I would disagree with what he said is I don't think the agreements at like the COP28 meeting or any of those really matter, because they don't seem to hold to them anyway. I think we'll know shortly, and I agree with you, we'll know shortly what that short period is. I don't know, but I think fusion is the game changer. And I think that's where we'll truly know. But yeah, largely what everybody said, I tend to agree with for the most part.
Amos, what did you think about the economics in the book? Yeah, I'm curious. I feel like he was pulling from a lot of, yeah, including Marxism, but pulling from a lot of different sources to try to kind of come up with what are the alternative. I mean, the one thing I definitely appreciated about it is that he made it clear that the current neoliberal system has got to change if we're going to get where we need to go. What did you think of the solutions he proposed? I'm looking at the economy. I'm not an economist, technically.
Some of the solutions I thought were were good and appropriate, and I think a lot could be taken from that. Especially if, like, if you're a graduate student or just a researcher, there's stuff in here that I think would be excellent research topics and possible solutions. Some of the other, I was trying to find the one, and I can't find it in the book, but there was a couple very good ones. I know he talked about like carbon taxes and some of those things, and I think from that perspective, it could be pretty rich for research areas. And I do think he got the modern monetary theory aspects wrong to a degree, but I thought largely, as far as a fiction writer knowing economics, he was pretty good.
I thought the thesis of central bankers reluctantly save the world was an interesting one. And, you know, especially working in the federal government and trying to tie this to central banks and their interests. But central banks, I just learned recently, you know, have a varying level of responsibility. There are a few European central banks that explicitly take on climate and carbon in their policy. Here in the US, we have goals like price stability and inflation control and employment that the central bank's responsible for, not explicitly climate change prevention. But I think, as you know, as these connections between the economy and the environment grow even more too obvious to ignore than they are now, which they're more obvious now than they were 10 years ago, you know, my hope is that maybe they'll be a little less reluctant even to get involved than they were in the book.
So Ken, are you saying you're a bit more optimistic than he was, that there is a mechanism by which central banks can implement some of the monetary policy he's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the Network for Greening the Financial System, you know, there are things out there that are starting the slow journey toward that. You know, not as fast as we'd all probably like, but perhaps faster than sleepwalking through an entire decade.
And actually, I don't know, did you see his talk? Because he actually made exactly that same point, that he said that the Network for Greening the Financial System is something he didn't know about when he wrote the book, but he's heard about it since, and that gives him a little bit more hope that we won't sleepwalk through the entire 2030s. So that's good that you agree.
I hadn't seen the talk, but I'm glad that that point came up.
Yep. And he also mentioned that there's another that the IMF is putting out something called special drawing rights, where they're not like publicizing it a lot, but apparently they are allowing for basically loans that are not repaid for specifically kind of green purposes to poor countries. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that program either. So yeah.
The IMF has some really innovative leadership in their statistics department at the moment that I'm hopeful will move the needle in some ways.
That's good. Yeah, that's a change from the past. What you need. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on? We didn't get a chance to yet.
I just wanted to say about the. I'm not an economist either, but it was very interesting, the discussion in the book about insurance and reinsurance and the impact that they have both locally and nationally and internationally as drivers of the change toward a green economy. I think we're already seeing that now in the state of Florida, for instance, that the insurance industry cannot survive climate change as currently structured, and that could be used as a lever to modify future behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was in the book or elsewhere, but I mean, that's become such a hot issue, no pun intended, that, you know, the idea that a 1.5 degree world is probably still insurable using modern models. A 2-degree world is iffy, and anything more than 2 degrees, you know, experts think it may not be insurable. That's a major shock to the existing system.
Yeah, so in addition to the kind of different economic models proposed in the book, he also talks about geoengineering, and it's an interesting thing, right? Because there's some, he talks about some geoengineering that's basically just kind of rogue nations or people doing this, like India, for example, in response to the massive heat wave that killed a bunch of people. In the book, they institute a geoengineering scheme to cool the planet, or at least their part of it, for a little while, and it's only partially successful. But then he also talks about efforts to stop glaciers moving into the ocean. So I'm curious what you all thought about, because this is kind of a controversial topic, obviously, when geoengineering is brought up. It's something that people kind of look askance at, and I thought that the book kind of had an interesting, more nuanced conversation about it in a way that was avoiding labeling it purely good or bad. But what did you all think about it, the way he talked about geoengineering in the book?
Yeah, I think those nuances were on target. I really think we're going to be forced at some level to do some of it. And there are studies going on to better understand some of the implications of some of the geoengineering technologies, and companies have formed. So I think it's almost inevitable. Some of it will happen, if not necessarily what India was doing in the book, which is a major intervention. But yeah, I thought he handled that pretty well.
I would agree with Barry. I think we're going to be, to his point, forced to do some of these things, whether we like it or not. I think the danger is, what are the ramifications of some of them? And I think that's where we have to be careful of, if we do these alternatives to try to better something, do we make something worse off on the other hand? But I think we're getting close to a point, if we're not already there, of really having no choice but to do something.
I guess I would like to ask everybody, when I hear forced and no choice, I kind of, in my mind, I have trouble separating or trying to find the catalytic agent for that. So is that coming from, like, the book, from the masses and the tragedy we talked about, potential tragedy? Is that a political solution? Is that coming from an economic solution, like insurance or whatever the case, or is it a blend? I would just like to hear people smarter than me talk about that.
Well, I think that the context in the book is around saving human lives, right? Is where they're talking about, so, and it kind of is, at least the one example of India, putting what do they put in the atmosphere? Basically sulfides, right? To prevent, to basically make the atmosphere cooler, similar to a volcanic eruption. But the idea being that they lost tens of millions of people to this heat wave, and the wealthy nations are doing nothing still. So this is the only, this is what they're choosing to do to protect their people. So I think that was an interesting way to present it, as a kind of last resort, right? I think, but then the one that I'm thinking of that's in contrast to that is, the scientists in Antarctica that are preventing the glaciers from going, they're putting they're moving the melt water out from under the glacier, so the glacier won't run into the ocean. And it's interesting that I mean, I think he's very pro science, which is great, but like, kind of like, oh, well, the scientists doing geoengineering, like, that's the right way to do it, almost, is kind of the way the book said it. Maybe you all read it differently, but I thought that was kind of an interesting contrast. And I think, yeah, to your point, it's kind of presented as, even if we decarbonize, we're still going to need to do some of these things to save lives and save property and, avoid huge sea level rise. So, yeah.
Well, historically, the main pressures come from Pacific Island nations or low-lying nations, but they don't have a strong political voice. But I think that's starting to expand to more powerful nations. It's a matter of life and death in some of these cases. Bangladesh comes to mind, the Maldives, and so on, that it's hard to see them not having significant impact on people without geoengineering, frankly.
Yeah, it feels to me like shades of, people say now we've gone past the point where anyone's debating adaptation. 5-10 years ago, people were saying, well, quit emitting and then we won't have to adapt. And now we have to do both. And it's like we're quickly sliding into having to adapt and geoengineer. Whereas if we'd done things a while back, we might not have had to. There was the other one, which was kind of visceral for me at the very end of the book, and briefly mentioned about dyeing the Arctic Ocean yellow to reduce its albedo.
Yeah.
And that just, for whatever reason, I was like, ooh, that, you get why, the poles are more sensitive, and that's a big expanse of blue if there's no ice up there. But something about that just didn't sit right.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. You're right. I forgot about that one. That was the other one that was mentioned.
And the idea that we might have to do multiple of these things,
Yeah. Yeah. And who decides to do them, right? That's the other, whose initiative, who's involved in that decision. I think some of the current anxiety around geoengineering is that, Elon Musk or some rogue person is going to just be like, I have $1 billion. I'm just going to go do this, with no consultation or input from any kind of democratic process or scientific process. Right. And unclear if we have anything that would stop that. So, yeah.
It's kind of like a game theory with 197 players, because, impacts aren't going to be all localized. So it is going to get very contentious. I would expect that it's not going to be a smooth process getting into geoengineering, but it's probably going to happen.
Yeah. And Ken, I love your point that, if we'd started way earlier, we wouldn't have to be doing as much adaptation. If we'd started earlier than that, we wouldn't have to be doing any geoengineering. So this is kind of like, the consequence of being slow to move on the mitigation front. And, I think that's a point that needs to be made more strongly. Like, the more we do now, the less we're going to have to get to that point. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a quote from someone, I feel like it's Al Gore, but it might not have been, saying that, if we had started this in the 90s, we'd have this little green bunny slope to ski down, and now we're staring at a double diamond that we've created for ourselves by waiting, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, for sure.
Complicating is, nations will have to look at the planet as a system. And I think Barry's point and Ken's point is, they're not local. Everybody's going to be looking at localized and individually. And in terms of solving this problem, we're going to have to look at it as a global system in order to address the real problems. And I'm not sure policymakers will get there. The business people might, to Bart's question, because they tend to be more global, but the politicians and the policymakers are so localized. It's going to have to change the thinking, and that's, I think, where we might run into some serious problems.
Was it an underlying assumption of the book? And I read it about 6 months ago, and I didn't have a chance to look at it again, actually about 8 months ago. Is it an underlying assumption of the book that this happens it happens with localized violence like in India, or is because I'm not so sure transition is going to be peaceful internationally. So I guess my question is the book assuming that the world, because of this upward pressure, loss of lives and things, will make these changes, or is that an accurate assumption? I'd like to hear what people think about that.
You raise a great point, Bart, that I think, yeah, and this is another thing I really appreciate about this book. I think his engagement with a lot of these topics that often are discussed in very black and white terms, or or simplistic terms, he engages with them in a very nuanced way. And violence is another theme, thank you for, that I was going to mention, because, I think he does introduce that into the book in a very, he's not taking a clear kind of stance on it. Looking at it in a very nuanced way, I think. So yeah, there's both, as you say, the kind of upward pressure from the suffering and violence inflicted on people as victims of the climate crisis. But then he also is engaging with violence as a tactic, right, for social change that some people are engaging with. And one of the key kind of conflicts of the book, right, is the central character, Mary, in her relationship with actually two other individuals, right? One of whom she knows at the beginning is kind of quote a criminal who's done, and the other who's her colleague that she finds out later has been engaged in this violent social change, right? And I think that the conclusion of the book is somewhat ambiguous as to how that violence actually, whether it helped or hurt it, right? I think I think it's an interesting discussion. I don't know. What do you all think about the way that he engaged with that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think it's kind of value free. It's just, organic. It just happens. And of course, Mary gets kidnapped and later develops a good relationship with her kidnapper and sees things somewhat from his perspective, which was interesting. And, but other people are shooting down planes and things like that as a way to deal with fossil fuel use. So yeah, I think it's kind of organic, evolves that way.
The topic.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, the thing that to me was violent adjacent, which he dealt with in a lot of nuance, and it's such a huge topic here, was migration and refugees, and how does that feed in our current model that we've been living with globally for the last 10 years or so, where large refugee populations spark right-wing nationalist authoritarian movements that are more prone to violence. He didn't have a situation where Russia invaded Ukraine, or you've got this conflict between Israel and Gaza right now. But how do we diffuse those tensions brought about by the othering in the way that that's engaged in the right-wing nationalism? And that's a huge question in itself. But I feel like this tie between violence and refugees and our inability to not other people in a way that makes us more prone to violence.
Yeah, and given the anti-science backlash, which is not insignificant, that doesn't bode well for future refugee challenges.
Well, I think a resource challenge is refugees. Absolutely. I mean, I hadn't even thought about that. You think, but sticking with India and water sources from the Himalayas and things like that, is as those glaciers go and water resources become scarce, a country like India under pressure could really expand. And I guess I have a bias because of my background in Indo-PACOM military background, but confrontation between China and India over resources is something that I could see. And I guess back to the book, I remember thinking, these are violence on a personal group level, and I was thinking, what about state to state violence? So I guess that was my point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you know, the characters in the book who engage in violence are portrayed very sympathetically. I mean, I think that he empathizes with their drive to, he goes into their backstory about, the things they've seen and the desperate way they feel about needing to create change. And so, yeah, it's definitely not a kind of one-dimensional view. And maybe it's kind of like the same point about geoengineering, right? Like the more we push this down the road and don't do anything, and that creates human suffering, the more we're going to see people resort to violence to bring about the changes they need. I think that's part of his point in the book.
And to that point, Laura, there's just group individual violence, which we learned from Al Qaeda, can have international, ramifications, and so it is nuanced, and there's a connection between all of it.
Yeah. So there's another passage I wanted to read to y'all and get your takes on, because I think it's so relevant to ecological economics, but everybody else, I think, who's trying to create change. So I thought this is, he has these little kind of mini chapters that are like dialogues between two people around a topic. And so chapter 99, which in my version is on page 505. So I'll just read a piece of this here. He says, we're here today to discuss whether any of the so-called totalizing solutions to our current problems will serve to do the job. No. So again, this is a dialogue. The other person says no. I have to ask, do you mean no to the question or no to the topic? No to the question. There is no single solution adequate to the task. Again, meaning this transition, right? And so what can we expect to see? Failure. Expand on that, please. Is success made of failures? Yes, a cobbling together from less than satisfactory parts, a slurry, a bricolage, an unholy mess. Will this in itself create problems? Of course. Such as, this is the interesting part I thought, such as the way like-minded people working to solve the same problem will engage in continuous civil war with each other over methods, thus destroying their chances of success. Why does that happen, do you think? The narcissism of small differences. That's an odd name. And he says, well, sometimes the differences aren't so small, right? The front is broad. I thought that was a fascinating observation, because I feel like you see this all the time, right? I see it among my colleagues, my students, even any discussion of climate change online, that people who are probably like 99.9% aligned on this is where we need to go will devolve into these ferocious conflicts over, well, this is the way to do it. Well, this is the way to do it. And I really appreciate that he called this out and says that this is kind of an unavoidable aspect of organizing social movement. But what do you all think? Like, what was your reaction to that chapter?
Yeah, well, a perfect example of it is, what's the economist solution traditionally? Carbon taxes. Well, not exactly a new idea. And what do we have in the real world? We have a hodgepodge of carbon taxes and fees in various countries, most of which have exemptions. So, this is what happens in the real world. Real perfect solutions are only academic.
What a great line. Narcissism of small differences. I think I'm going to use that one again.
This is literally one of only a half dozen pages in the book that I dog-eared for this reason, Laura. I just love this passage. It was really one of my favorites of the whole book, so I'm glad you brought it up. And yeah, I'm sorry to say, what I see, professionally for me really seems to bear it out. I've been part of this group of hundreds of people worldwide trying to create an environmental economic accounting system that does a better job of measuring and reporting on this stuff. And the little ticky-tack differences that we argue about, either to keep the moral high ground or to keep our work more relevant, it's a real sticking point.
Yeah, this passage reminded me of, I was listening to an interview with the brilliant activist and scholar Loretta J. Ross recently, and she was coming from the civil rights and anti-violence against women movement. But she said something like, a group of people walking in the same direction with different ideas in their heads is a movement. A group of people walking in the same direction with the same idea in their heads is a cult, right? And I thought that was really interesting, that like reminded that we're trying to create a movement, not a cult. So we're allowed to have differences in the way we think about and approach things, as long as we're kind of walking in the same direction, I think is a really important reminder. So I guess like how do you combat this narcissism of small differences? What do you all think? What's the antidote to that?
Violence, right? Isn't it the interpersonal violence?
I mean, I've in my own thinking on this, I've really thought hard about this, and the ideas I have, I don't think are satisfactory, but like, what are the common values, the obvious common shared values? Something's causing us to all march in the same direction. So like emphasizing that over the differences, and, humanizing ourselves, getting to know each other as people rather than just carriers of a particular flag. And also the sorts of group dynamics. And, Laura, you've been in academia. I feel like, there's this shift in academia between the old school patriarchal, alpha male variety versus a more egalitarian version of academia that's struggling to emerge. And, I think sometimes it's just a matter of like having the folks at the table that are willing to cooperate and aren't just there for the sake of butting heads.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I also think, I mean, you alluded earlier to, there are some of our structures and institutions that reward this type of one-upmanship and narcissism, right? Rather than rewarding collaboration. So, I mean, academia being a case in point where, if your idea is the best one, you publish a paper criticizing everybody else instead of, trying to build coalitions or build consensus around something. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is starting to change, but yeah, that's kind of the old model, right? And like who gets funding? It's a person that says that everybody else is doing it wrong, so you should give the money to us, right? But I wonder too. I love your ideas, Ken. Something I thought about too is I think we also just don't listen to each other. I think that we, somebody says something that we don't quite understand or that triggers a response, and we just respond to it without trying to understand, well, what do you actually mean by that? Why are you saying that? Getting curious about the differences and discovering that actually the person might be much more aligned with us than we think they are. They just were talking about it in a different way. I've seen that happen so many different times where somebody uses especially now, I think, where, understandably our language for talking about things and the conscientiousness that we have is evolving. I think that's good. But sometimes I think we can get very then impatient with somebody who's not caught up with the way we talk about things now. And rather than, taking the time to understand and educate, we sometimes jump right into like, oh, well, you're bad. You said this, you're bad. And I think we need to have a little bit more patience to understand where each other is coming from and listen to each other. So
I'm sorry to point this out, and I won't actually name names here, but I feel like for those of us involved with the society for a while, like you've seen this in action. You've seen folks take their ball and leave, UC, or just because of this narcissism of small differences. So like our own society has been victim of it, unfortunately.
Wow. Really, I love the discussion back and forth between you two. I was just thinking as you were talking, maybe this is why it takes crises to really generate action and movement, because when you have crises and a lot of pain, all of a sudden that narcissism of small differences is not as potent. Things just don't matter as much, and you got to take care of the problem.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I think, Ken, like you're saying, I think we all need to realize it's time to move into a new era and look for coalitions and collaboration, and that doesn't mean we have to agree about everything. There may be some things that we still don't agree, and we're doing, different versions, but like, if it's 95% we're there, then can we work on the 95% and leave the 5% to the margins, Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good point about the importance of listening. And I think today Kyle gets the award because it's 48 minutes in and he hasn't said a word.
Mostly just trying to administer things in the background, but
Which Kyle is brilliant at, and yeah, has helped us with all of our setting up of these things. So thank you, Kyle. Yeah, so I wanted, we can wrap up at the top of the hour. I know you all are pretty busy, but I just wanted to give the floor to any other things in the book that I didn't mention that popped out at you that you really wanted to get some perspectives on, or just really struck you, you really responded to, or didn't like, or liked.
Well, I'll throw one out there, and I'm curious to hear all your thoughts as mostly as credentialed scientists here. But the role that Mary's number two person is saying throughout the book that we need a new religion, and they have this world consciousness movement at the end of the book for one very short chapter. And I thought that was interesting that that got a nod. It wasn't completely ignored. It also certainly wasn't emphasized, and probably in a way that wouldn't turn people off if it was turned into an overtly spiritual novel. But certainly the role of spirituality, religion, and interconnection in that way. I don't know. What do people think of that? And
Yeah, I think
how colored are you by your own religious or unreligious views?
no, I think the late Herman Daly would have liked that, sort of the ultimate ends, what are we all doing this for? And people often get very confused in the process of doing what they think they're supposed to be doing, and disillusioned. But I think it was good that the book made people feel uncomfortable to some extent, while also reeling them in with a lot of personal stories and narratives. That's a difficult thread to make, but I think he was masterful at that, and it ended at a fairly good place. It's not calm and simple, because that's not what we're looking at, but I think it was very appropriate in the end. And I read every word and didn't have any trouble getting through it.
I think it's an interesting question, Ken, because while I'm not an expert on all religions, the ones that I know about, you're supposed to be a good steward of the earth. You're supposed to take care of what we have. And, I find it interesting. I'll put it, I'm a Christian. I find it interesting that a lot of Christians get, triggered by, the word climate change or green. When you're supposed to be caring of what we have. So I find that push pull very interesting, and I find it odd that happens, because if you're truly going to follow that religion or religions, that's what it's telling you to do. So I understand that you can have disagreements on certain levels, but I always say you can't argue about climate change. You can argue about the degrees of what caused it if you want to, but we still need to solve the problem. So to me, I think that was an interesting comment and question that you brought up, because I think you're perhaps thinking along those lines, and I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, I agree, Ken. I thought that was an interesting aspect of the book. I wonder if I mean, look, any casual observer, and you know, I'm a person of faith too, but any casual observer can look out at the world and be like, what is one of the drivers of conflict and lack of coming together? Religion, right? So I think this is his attempt to take on, well, what if we all rallied around a different religion, you know? But an alternative could be, you know, emphasizing that common thread of creation care, as you were saying, John, that's in multiple religions and philosophies for people who are not religious, right? So, and I do see this happening a little bit. There are interfaith networks that are dedicated to environmental protection and, you know, emphasizing, you know, the mandate to care for creation in, you know, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist traditions, etc. So I think, you know, we don't necessarily maybe have to create a new religion. I don't know if that's going to work. It's people have tried, right? And, you know, like mostly those, if you try to create a new religion, it tends to turn into a cult, right? I don't know, but maybe, you know, rather rallying around common values that are common to all religions could work to get that kind of spiritual relationship more in balance for those who need it. Yeah. But yeah, it was interesting. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm curious, do any of you have suggestions? I really enjoyed this, and maybe we could do it, you know, once a semester. I always think in semesters because I'm an academic. Apologies. I know I made this mistake once of talking to one of our stakeholders in Flint and saying, oh, well, in the spring, I'm going to start doing this. And he was like, wait, the spring? I was like, yeah, January. He's like, January's not the spring. I'm like, sorry, I'm an academic. I think of January as the start of spring semester, which is crazy to anybody else. But anyway, if we do this once a semester, do you all have a suggestion for what is the next book we should read? Anybody have something that they think would be great to read? One option is that, I don't know if you all have been following the USSEE Prize, which is co-chosen between USSEE and that, yeah. So they have, the winners of the USSEE Prize are some fantastic books in ecological economics that are written for a lay audience, because that's the point of the award. They do tend to be nonfiction. You know, I guess this was a little bit unusual. It's a fiction book, but if any of you have brilliant ideas for a book that we should read, let us know.
I love the idea and I love the frequency, Laura. I mean, you know, twice a year perhaps isn't so much to be overwhelming, but, you know, is enough to get a small group of people who wouldn't otherwise see each other together.
Exactly. And this is a pretty meaty book too. I mean, this was like more than 500 pages. So I felt like this, you need a few months to get through this one, maybe. Yeah, depending on how much free time you have. So. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Any parting thoughts?
No, just that I really, really enjoyed it. Great idea. Thanks for hosting it, Laura.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for coming. All right. Well, maybe we'll send out a poll to everybody who is interested to see, like, if anybody has an idea for a book, you know, that had to leave early or couldn't hop on. So.
I think the USSEE Prize is a good, it's a good fallback if you don't get other suggestions, because those are, you know, obviously reviewed. And
yeah, I don't know. Did any of you read the first inaugural winner of the prize, Bathsheba DeMuth's book, The Floating Coast? It's fascinating. It was a take on the Arctic economy, the natural resource economy, but really what it was looking at the contrast between the communist economy in the USSR at that time and the capitalist economy in the United States and Canada, but how they both were very exploitative and of the resources in the Arctic, and yeah, it was just fascinating. And she had a lot of really interesting. You know, she's a journalist, but she wrote a lot about economics and natural resources. So that's a possibility. And then the USSEE Prize winner last year was the Beyond Capitalism book, which was also really good. So, but that was much more like, I mean, basics of ecological economics. So I don't know how interesting it would be for us to discuss, and, you know, but we'll see. Yeah, if you have any ideas, let me know.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Laura.
Happy holidays.